or whether it's due to our thoughts and emotions and memories. This is what Selye talked about when he coined this term stress in his book, The Stress of Life. Now the key is we have to learn how to work with it. So stress isn't so much about having exposure to various threats. It's about how we react to those threats. We can even find that beneficial things like a marriage or a new job or moving to a new city or having a child all can be stressors. So how we react to them can be positive or it can be negative, depending upon how we react to it. In English, we have words that derive from Latin, where we say if we have a bad response to it, we consider it to be distress. And if we have a good response to it, it's eustress, getting a new job. It can be a good thing, but it can also be stressful, because then I have to change the way I go to work and how I dress and what do I do and how do I act, and I have more responsibility. So some people, when they get a new job, it becomes a bad thing as opposed to a good thing. So it's all about how we react to it. So our body is responding to stress acutely. And as I said, when we look at it chronically, we need to be concerned about, what happens if it's overwhelming, if it's over and over and over again. And one of the things that has been learned in the stress literature more recently is that, and this is an important thing to recall or to know, is that psychological stressors have the ability to maintain our stress response, elevate it and maintain it more than physical stressors. So if we have people who have had trauma in their life, if they have been mistreated or abused, and they keep reliving that in their life, they will have chronic stress. There are others who have been in the same situation who have a different relationship to it, and they move past that in their life, and they don't continue to have that chronic stress. So psychological stressors, our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors can do more to make us sick than even just the physical stressors that are going on. This is a PhD from Stanford, Dr. Bob Sapolsky. And he highlights this and says, why is it that human beings have this problem with chronic stress, but animals don't have this problem with chronic stress? And it relates to these thoughts, these behaviors, and these emotions. The animal recognizes that it's just a part of life. If the lion kills one of the zebras inside the group, they know that that is part of life. With human beings, if that happens, then we'll constantly be concerned and looking, what's going to happen to me? Oh, I'm very afraid. And then I'm having stress and stress happening all the time. And as we'll see, those stressors can have an effect on our hormones, on our ability to fight infection, on our ability to be healthy. Because we spend all this time in the adrenaline state, the kind of, I'm really concerned that something's going to happen now. So Selye studied this, and he said that when we have these stresses, they leave a scar, making us a little older each time. Cellier's work discovered the importance of cortisol. Cortisol, a catabolic hormone, is also called a glucocorticoid. He said when we're producing cortisol over and over and over again in response to chronic stress, that is what creates problems. That is what creates the pathology. So long ago, 100 years ago, the idea was that stress was all about the adrenaline response, the sympathetic response. Cellier helped us to begin to understand around the stimulation of the hypothalamic and pituitary axis. We'll see that later understanding is that the hypothalamic and pituitary axis is also controlled by what our thoughts and what our feelings and behaviors are. So within the stress model, what we find is a stress occurs, and when that stress occurs, our cortisol levels go up. And over time, our cortisol levels go back down. That's normally what should happen. But if that happens again and again and again, initially, our cortisol levels are going to stay up all the time because they're saying, oh, it's always happening. But over a long period of time of life, the body can't continue to sustain those cortisol levels at the same high rate. And then we move into this phase of exhaustion. So this is Cellier's work. So first, when we respond to stress, we have arousal, and we have more and more stimulation of the adrenal gland happening. Then, as we adapt to that, we kind of keep the levels high, as I said. And then when we move into more and more chronic stress, we can't keep those stress levels high, and so then we become exhausted. And there, our levels of DHEA and cortisol become very low. So in the first phase, DHEA and cortisol are high. In the second phase, DHEA begins to go down. And in the third phase, DHEA and cortisol go down. You may recall that DHEA is a rest and recovery hormone. It's an anabolic hormone. And so it's necessary and important for helping to keep us strong and healthy. It's also a precursor for the production of testosterone and for estrogens. And this is why I say it's most important when you're dealing with any kind of hormonal imbalance going on. You need to see what's happening first with the adrenal glands. Now I'm going to move through these few slides from Dr. McEwen. Basically what he's talking about here is that our perceived stress about what's going on in our mind and how we respond to it. If we feel we're stressed, or you may have patients who say, I had a stressful day, so I'm going to go smoke, or I had a stressful day, so I'm going to drink. Or I had a stressful day, so I'm going to eat McDonald's and sit in front of the television set because of their response to their perception of stress. There was nothing there that happened that day where their life was at risk and they might die like a tiger at the door. But they perceived the problem. And so here we begin to see that our thoughts are having a very significant effect overall on our body's reaction to what's occurring. So Cellier talked about the hypothalamic pituitary axis. Now McEwen talks more about how our thoughts and our feelings and our memories have an impact on what's going on. So stress, it's not really what happens to you, it's how you react to what's happening to you. And what we find is that if we react in a negative way, it will cause our cortisol levels to go up. We'll be agitated, we'll be wired, we'll have an increase in inflammation because those stressors actually create free radicals that cause inflammation to go on. And we won't be able to settle down and relax. We'll learn that there's some tools like heart rate variability biofeedback that can help to bring balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. So what's the key to this? What's the linchpin? This is a linchpin, helping to keep the, there we go, light, there we go, helping to keep the wheel on. Well, what we find is that the normal reaction of arousal and adaptation and exhaustion is something that we have the capacity to be able to look at and understand in our patients. As I said, first, in the arousal state, cortisol, you need it for the fight or flight response, because when you have an acute stress, you want the system in the body to say, you know, I need more glucose so that I can fight or run away from this tiger that's at the door. That's what happens. So there's a release of glucose into the body. There's a movement of the blood vessels where they open up in the arms and the legs to allow that action to occur. There's movement. There's also a decrease in the overall immune response, because the body is making a decision. It says, oh, I have a runny nose. Should I spend my energy in my body to fight this little runny nose, or should I spend the energy in my body to run away from the tiger that's there? So it decreases the immune reaction that's going on. These are the normal phenomena that occur as part of the stress response. There's a balance. There's a release of cortisol, the catabolic hormone, and a release of DHEA. DHEA acts to help support the immune system. It helps the body as a whole. So that when the body is releasing these hormones, it's releasing them together in balance with each other. We see DHEA. DHEA has been used even as a supplement for people because it was thought to be the fountain of life. DHEA is an important hormone. It is an anabolic hormone that is important for the synthesis of testosterone and then on to the estrogens. And what we see with DHEA when we're looking at individuals is we see that their DHEA levels, whether we measure it in their serum or whether we measure it with fatty acids, is high during their 20s and 30s, and then it drops down. No matter how we measure it, by the time they're about 40 years old, their levels are lower. This is an effect of the process of aging. We know this because when we take two people who are, say, 50 years old, and we measure their DHEA, and in the group that has a very low DHEA, they're more sick, they have more illness, they're in the hospital more, versus the group who has the high DHEA, and they're more healthy, and they're not sick, and they're not in the hospital. Many different studies have been done. So some people have thought, oh, well, what we should do then is just be able to give people DHEA and that will make the difference. But it doesn't. We need to find the balance within the system ourselves. So initially, when we're stressed, our DHEA and cortisol go up. Then, as that's happening for a long time, our DHEA begins to drop finally to a place where our cortisol drops and is depressed also. Now we can see in the early stage where the cortisol is still high and the DHEA is beginning to go down, we may see these people as having symptoms of agitation, anxiety, difficulty sleeping. These are the people who are kind of like this in that response. So the cortisol's increased. Now when the cortisol's increased, if you remember from that very complex graph that I had at the beginning, if you have progesterone over here and cholesterol, and most of it is going to produce cortisol, then there's not as much to be able to produce DHEA and not as much to be able to produce testosterone and estrogen. This idea is called cortisol steal because the cortisol is stealing the hormone. So we see right here, instead of going in this direction, you see that those arrows got lost, right? Those arrows right there, they got lost because the body is going to try to produce more of the cortisone down here. It's moving in this direction and it's coming downward to make more and more cortisol. And as that happens, we have less and less of the anabolic hormones of DHEA, androstenedione, testosterone. These are anabolic hormones here. And that also means we have less of the estrogens. This cortisol steal effect, when we're producing more cortisol at the expense of making anabolic hormones. So we see these patients who initially are making more and more cortisol and stealing, the cortisol is stealing the DHEA away. We see these people responding with having more agitation. Remember that I said that when you have high cortisol levels, your body is saying, I need to run away from the tiger. Even though the tiger was only happening in your dream. And that means that the immune system is suppressed and doesn't work as well. Now, when that happens over and over again, and I move to the point where I don't have enough cortisol anymore either, and I'm exhausted, these are the patients we see who have pain all over, so-called fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, post-traumatic stress disorder, postpartum depression. We see a lot of different symptoms that come up in these people. So evaluating whether the person is in the hyper state of cortisol or the hypo state of cortisol, aroused or depressed, high cortisol, low cortisol. How do we look at that? How do we evaluate that? Well, we're going to talk about serum testing, urine testing, salivary testing, but I would say that the single best tool that I have found is the salivary measure of free cortisol, because it allows me to look at 4 different points in a person over time in a single day. I can see, are they having an excess of cortisol? Are they having normal cortisol? Are they having low cortisol? Are they having normal DHEA? Are they having low DHEA? Now, we can measure cortisol in the plasma, but I told you earlier that most of it, 97% of it, is bound to cortisol binding globulin. So when the cortisol is low, I don't know if it's because the cortisol is low or because the cortisol binding globulin is low. That's circulating with it. In fact, one of the things that we find in terminology is that when we stimulate the body with adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, we find that even when the cortisol levels in saliva are low, the adrenal is still able to produce them. When the adrenal gland is not able to produce cortisol, that is called Addison's disease. There is a big difference between having a poor response. And this is the difference, if you will, between functional medicine and endocrinology disease of Addison's, is that in our populations we see on the order of, in one study we did, 30% of the people had high cortisol levels in saliva, 40% of the people had very, very low cortisol levels. It's very common for your adrenal gland to not function properly. It's not because the adrenal gland can't function, it's because it's not being told by the hypothalamic pituitary axis. So that's why when we measure plasma cortisol levels, it's really not telling us about function, it's telling us about disease. We can measure cortisol in urine as well. When we measure cortisol in urine, we would want to measure it over 24 hours period of time, and we don't see the ups and downs that occur. So salivary measures of cortisol end up being some of the best measures that we have. We can measure both of these chemicals, probably less important for you to know because they move together with each other. DHEA is the one that's been used more. But what I want to do is show you some pictures of what happens with salivary cortisol. We do is we measure the salivary cortisol when the person wakes up in the morning, and then 4 hours later, 4 hours later, and in the evening time. So we can see changes that occur. Another way to measure cortisol level is by measuring it right when they wake up and taking 3 measurements. But we're going to see, looking for my picture here. So what we can see with the overall cortisol steal is that cortisol and DHEA both end up coming, as I said, from the same place. So if we have more and more stress and more production of cortisol, we end up seeing that there is less production of DHEA because they both come from the same precursors in the first place. So with the diurnal variation of cortisol, what we see is we should see an elevation of the cortisol first thing in the morning, and then it comes down over the course of the day at noon, a little lower in the late afternoon, and lowest at night. And we should see the DHEA to be in the normal green range right here. Now, as I said, when we have a stress happening over and over and over again, normally we respond and the cortisol back down. But when it's chronic, the cortisol levels stay high. And so we see the cortisol levels staying high over the course of the day. This is the person who's aroused. This hasn't been happening for a long time, so their DHEA levels are still high. They're still in the normal range. We call this hyperactivity of the adrenal gland, wired, aroused, and up. But as I said, when we see stressors happening over and over again, causing more and more and more cortisol production, over time, that means that there is less DHEA and less of these anabolic hormones produced. So in the short term, the normal response of having high cortisol is to give us energy, to fight or to flight. And that's what we want to have happen. But when those cortisol levels continue to stay high, not only do we see the loss of DHEA, but we also see the immune system is depressed, the sugar levels go high. Cortisol is a counter-regulatory hormone. Cortisol releases glucose from the liver. It takes the glycogen that's in the liver and it breaks it down, makes it into glucose, so the body has energy to fight or flight. It also, as I said in one of the earlier slides, it slows down the conversion of T4 to T3. So it has all of these effects. So as we see again, cortisol will have an impact on the release of TSH, and it will also, a negative effect, it will slow that down, and it will slow down the conversion of T4 to T3. In the acute state of acute stress, you don't need the effects of TSH and thyroid hormone in the very acute state. But chronically you do. So if you have stress over and over and over again, and you decrease the conversion of T4 to T3, you will have problems. So let's look at thyroid hormone for a moment. Again, thyrotropic releasing hormone, TRH, is released from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland then releases TSH. TSH goes to the thyroid gland to make thyroxine, T4. T4 requires a tyrosine molecule and 4 iodines. And the enzymes that are necessary, which are magnesium and zinc dependent, in order to be able to allow that to happen. That releases the T4, which is inactive, and it goes into the liver and the kidney. The liver and the kidney can either make a normal T3 or a reverse T3. Both of these molecules have 3 iodines on them. But you can see the T3 is able to hold the clicker. The reverse T3 kind of can't hold the clicker. It doesn't function properly. Well, we're going to see that stress, chronic stress where the cortisol is elevated, actually slows down that pathway from working properly. So what does this mean for you when you have a patient who you're evaluating who is tired or depressed, and you evaluate their TSH hormone, and their TSH is a little bit high because they don't have enough T3. And the feedback, the body's saying, I need more T3. And the TSH you've measured is high because it's trying to make more T3. And the free T3 that you're measuring down here is low. And so you say, well, I'll give them more thyroid. Well, when you give patients thyroid, what form of thyroid do you give? Does anybody know the answer to that? When you give thyroid hormone, what form do you give? Usually. I don't know the names of what you call it here, but L-thyroxine is T4. What do you call it? Kisa? So we give T4. If the TSH is high and the free T3 is low, and we give TSH, or we give T4 to this person, what's going to happen? Is it going to help? No, because it's not being metabolized properly. So now, all of a sudden, we're back to the conversation that I started with that said, if you have someone who's got thyroid problems going on, you want to make sure you understand what's happening with their adrenal glands first. Because if they have chronic stressors, that's going to slow down that conversion. This interrelationship is important. Now, there's other factors besides stress that will slow this down. There's nutritional factors. You need to have the right amount of selenium and zinc. You need to have the right amount of vitamin A and vitamin E and B2, riboflavin. You have to have proper amounts of cortisol. When you have too much cortisol, it blocks the pathway. We're going to see in a moment that when you have too little cortisol, that pathway becomes more active. So over time, when we have more and more and more cortisol,